You've heard the labels. Boomers are entitled. Gen X doesn't care. Millennials are fragile. Gen Z can't put their phones down. Every generation gets reduced to a caricature, and every generation pushes back on it. But somewhere underneath the stereotypes, there's a real question. Does when you were born actually shape your psychology? And if it does, how? Here's what the research actually shows. It's more complicated than a label, and more interesting. Generational psychology isn't new. The idea that being born into a particular moment in history shapes who you become was first formalized nearly a century ago by sociologist Karl Mannheim in a 1928 essay that remains one of the foundational texts in the field. Mannheim argued that people who experience significant historical events during their formative years, roughly adolescence and early adulthood, develop a shared consciousness, a common way of interpreting the world. But he also stressed something that modern conversations tend to forget. Not every birth cohort develops a distinct generational identity. It depends on whether the pace of social change is fast enough to create genuinely different conditions of growing up. Today, that pace of change is extraordinarily fast, and the research suggests it's not primarily the big events, wars, recessions, pandemics, that create the deepest generational shifts. It's something more pervasive than any single event. Psychologist Jean Twenge at San Diego State University has spent 3 decades studying generational change. In her analysis of 24 national datasets encompassing roughly 43 million people, she argues that technology, not events, is the primary driver of generational differences. The argument is not that technology is simply a distraction. It's that each major technological shift changes the conditions of daily life in ways that reshape psychology. Television changed how people encountered other perspectives. Birth control changed family structure. The internet changed how knowledge was accessed. And smartphones changed how adolescents socialize, form identities, and experience solitude. According to Twenge's cross-temporal meta-analyses, these technology-driven changes produce 2 downstream effects that shape generations differently. The first is rising individualism. Across generations, there's a measurable shift toward more focus on the self and less on collective obligation. Values have moved toward money, fame, and image, and away from community feeling and affiliation. The second is what Twenge calls the slow life strategy. Each successive generation reaches traditional milestones, leaving home, getting a job, marrying, having children, later than the one before. Childhood extends, adolescence stretches, the developmental timeline slows. And this is not about laziness or economic failure. It's a pattern consistent with societies where lifespans are longer and technology removes the urgency of early independence. And then there's mental health. CDC Youth Risk Behavior. Survey data shows that 42% of Gen Z high schoolers reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness in 2021, nearly 50% higher than millennial high schoolers in the early 2000s. Among girls, the figure rose from 35% in 2001 to 57% in 2021. These are not small differences. They represent measurable shifts in psychological well-being that track with the timing of smartphone adoption and social media saturation. Whether that's causation or correlation is still debated, but the pattern is striking. So the data shows real generational differences in values, in mental health, in developmental timing. But here's where the science gets more honest than most generational content on the internet. A growing body of researchers argues that the entire concept of generations as distinct psychological groups is deeply flawed. A major review published in the Journal of Business and Psychology by Rudolph, Ravola, Costanza, and Zacher examined the evidence and concluded that support for generational differences as a meaningful scientific construct is, in their words, scant. The core problem is something called the age period cohort identification problem. When you survey people at a single point in time, you can't tell whether a difference between a 25-year-old and a 55-year-old is because of their generation, their age, or the specific moment in history when the survey was taken. These three variables are mathematically linked. If you know any two, you know the third. And that means you can never fully untangle them. A meta-analysis of work-related attitudes found only small to moderate effects when comparing generations, and frequently no significant differences at all. The National Academies of Sciences even recommended against using generational categories in workplaces, concluding that generational characteristics should be treated as stereotypes. Even the narcissism debate, one of the most publicized generational claims, is contested. Twenge's research found increases in narcissistic traits across cohorts, but other researchers, using overlapping data and different analytical approaches, found no significant change. The science is not settled. Even Pew Research Center, one of the most prominent users of generational categories, acknowledged the limitations in 2023. They committed to only conducting generational analysis with long-running historical datasets, controlling for factors beyond age, and not defaulting to generational labels when life stage explanations might be more accurate. Here's what the research actually shows. Generational differences are real, but they're not what most people think. They're not personality types. They're not identity categories. They're the psychological residue of growing up in a world that was changing at a particular speed in a particular direction. The strongest driver of those differences is technology, which reshapes not just what people do, but how fast they grow up, what they value, and how they experience their own minds. And the honest truth is that much of what we call generational psychology is tangled up with age, life stage, and cultural change in ways that even the best research can't fully separate. Knowing this won't stop people from using generational labels, but it might change how much weight you give them. The person sitting across from you is not a generation. They're a human being shaped by timing, technology, and a set of formative experiences they didn't choose, just like you. This is part of a larger pattern in how modern life encourages us to sort people into categories, when the reality is that the forces shaping us are shared, just experienced at different speeds and different moments. This is the human frame, facts first, context always. If this changed how you see something, subscribe. We'll keep going.